The stage is set for Oregon football. The Ducks have earned their rematch with the Washington Huskies as a rivalry takes center stage in Las Vegas for the Pac-12 title game. We're previewing that game and predicting the final score on today's episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. And we're back like we never left. Oregon fans, what's going on? How we living? Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres, and we are super excited to be coming at you with another episode of the pod. It is Wednesday, November 29th, 2023, and joining me on today's episode, I have a very special guest, the publisher of Inside the Huskies, the Washington Huskies Fan Nation Sports Illustrated channel. We got Dan Raley. How you doing, Dan? Thanks for being here.
Hi, Max. This is pretty much a professional operation. I should have put on a tuxedo or something.
I do the best I can. I'm really excited about this game and love doing the podcast on YouTube and getting it out in the podcasting realm. So we haven't done one of these since I lived in Eugene. Now I'm in Long Beach. We didn't get to do this the first time these two teams played. I was actually in Europe for my best friend's wedding. So I definitely wanted to take the opportunity to collaborate with you and bring you on for a Husky perspective on things, seeing that you're in Seattle, boots on the ground. So what we were going to do is preview this game, talk some key players and keys to the game type of deal, if you will. But just to start here, Dan, what is your feeling kind of going into this game, whether that's you personally or kind of bringing in the Husky fan base?
Well, Max, I don't know if you remember from our previous conversations, but I started with another guy from Oregon. We started working on a book on the Oregon-Washington football rivalry. So I know this rivalry upside down and backwards and frontwards, and this might be the biggest game of all, of everyone that's ever been played. Certainly, they've never been ranked like this, and they've never had probably talent like this, at least at the quarterback spot. So, I mean, it's a huge game. I'm going to pick a score for you, but if you ask me to be really serious about this, I'm going, I don't know who's going to win. It's either that side or that side. They're that good. And I think we're going into this without any really indication other than there's odds makers odds out there that gives Oregon a pretty huge lead, but I don't know what those guys know. Washington did win the first game. So anything goes, and it should be a perfect atmosphere in Las Vegas to do something like this with the whole nation watching and with everything at stake from a college football playoff, which would be, a long time coming for the Ducks and a long time coming again for the Huskies. And so it's a huge scenario, and I'm fired up to go see it.
I'm super fired up too. We were talking before we hit record. It'll be our first chance to meet in person. I think we've been doing this around the same time because I started in March of 21. So this is our third season, I think, kind of working alongside each other, I want to say, in the Pac-12.
Yeah, I just hit my 4-year anniversary. I started in actually 2019 in November after the Oregon-Washington game. They asked me to do it. I was still working, flying around the world for one of our favorite aerospace companies, and had a pretty interesting job there. But I picked up this. I've been a sports writer most of my life, and so I had to get back into it, and I did.
Well, I'm so glad that you did get back into it because it gives me the chance to bring you on my podcast and kind of pick your brain about the Huskies and just everything with this matchup. So let's get into it, Dan. Let's talk about this Oregon-Washington game. We know that Oregon and Washington are both coming off of rivalry wins, with the Huskies narrowly edging the Cougars in the Apple Cup, and then Oregon getting that big win over the Oregon State Beavers right before Jonathan Smith's departure to East Lansing to become the next Michigan State head coach. So I think let's start with the quarterbacks because Bo Nix and Michael Penix are both having themselves a heck of a season, both in the running for the Heisman Trophy. Seems like Nix might have the edge right now, just based on the latest odds and all of that. But I'd love to just start there if we could. What are your thoughts on Michael Penix and this Husky offense?
Well, it's been high powered all season, but it's tailed off just a little bit in the last couple of weeks. But one reason they played in a monsoon in Corvallis, they played in a windstorm against Arizona State in Husky Stadium, and then Penix has been sick for about a month and just playing through it. And he hasn't been as accurate throwing the football, but he's still been pretty good because they haven't lost a football game yet.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I think I find myself, I just recorded another podcast before this. Like, that's the thing that I find myself wrestling with a little bit, Dan, is like, if you're looking at how these two teams have played since that matchup in October, it seems pretty evident that Oregon's playing the better football, but you can't take anything away from Washington. They pulled it off 12-0, undefeated regular season, and obviously Penix and the offense behind Ryan Grubb was a big part of that.
Well, from the first game that I remember, both secondaries got lit up. And, I wasn't really impressed with either secondary. And so I think that's what it might come down to this time is who's more vulnerable in guarding against Penix and Nix. And that could probably decide it as, which cornerback falls down on a long route or something like that. Washington's got two cornerbacks. One is really, really good from Oklahoma State, and the other one's really vulnerable and gets picked on every game. So, we'll see who's looked at the tape close enough to see what the best weakness is. And I think it's probably attacking each secondary. So
I would find myself agreeing, especially with the health of Oregon's secondary right now isn't at 100%. Jalil Florence is questionable, I feel like you could say, at the very best, perhaps even doubtful, seeing that he was not available for the Oregon State game and was seen on crutches at that game. Not typically something that you see a guy on crutches one week and then he's suiting up the next, but we got to see. Dan Lanning didn't really show his cards as you would expect from a head coach when he was asked about that injury earlier on this week. So if the Ducks do need to turn to their depth, it's going to be guys like Dante Manning and Triquez Bridges, maybe a little bit of Nico Reed as well. But you talked about the secondary being big for Oregon, right? And kind of that matchup there. I'd love to get some of your thoughts on Roma Dunze because he's one of the three finalists for the Biletnikov. I know a lot of Oregon fans probably think that Troy Franklin got snubbed for the spectacular season that he's been having in his own right. But when we're talking about these Washington wide receivers, it really starts with Roma Dunze. He's a special talent.
Well, getting back to Troy Franklin, it's like, who picks these things? I mean, how do you decide that Troy Franklin should not be one of the final three? Is it because you live in the South or on the East Coast? Why don't you have both Dunze and Franklin on this list? But that's what gets me. I used to be a voter on everything from the Heisman to the AP top 25, and I just see how subjective all of that is. And some guys pay for it, and Dunze, paid for it last year when they started the season. Nobody gave him any kind of recognition at all because he played for a 4-8 football team and that had no offense. So I knew he was pretty good. And I also knew he was going to pay for, that downturn of Husky football because they couldn't get the ball in his hands. And they're actually lucky that he stuck around and hung with the new coaching staff that came in. And he, the new offense, pass happy, wide open, high powered offense has been perfect for him. And he took it up a notch in making himself heavier and stronger. I think I've kidded him that he's another DK Metcalf because he's 6'3", 215, and DK Metcalf's about 6'3", 235, I think. And he liked that comparison. And he, you can see that he can outfight guys for the football. I don't know if that was the case before. So he's a much more physical receiver, which makes him suited for the NFL. So I think, nobody's been able to stop him lately. If you just gear up on him, maybe double team him, things like that, maybe that'll work. But, he's got other wide receivers that are pretty good. So.
Yeah, he's not the only one in that room. You got Jalen McMillan, who I was talking with Roman Tomashoff, who you're obviously very familiar with on one of my previous podcasts. And it sounds like McMillan's going to be probably the healthiest he's been in a while for the Huskies. So that's big. And you got Giles Jackson as well in the mix there. He had a touchdown in that first game between the Ducks and the Huskies. So we know that Washington's going to be able to air that thing out. At least that's their primary game plan, I would think, with a quarterback like that and the skill talent at his disposal. For for this Oregon defense, they're going to have to try to get Penix out of the pocket and on the move a little bit. I think he is an athletic quarterback, but I'm not sure I would describe him as entirely dual threat, or at least we haven't seen that part of his game too much this year. So we know he's at the most comfortable in the pocket. So they're going to need to get disruptive with guys like Brandon Dorlus, Jordan Birch, and the like, getting some pressure on Penix on Friday.
Well, that would be true, but his situation is he doesn't run much because he got beat up pretty bad in the Big Ten. He got injured 4 times and had 4 seasons end, and a couple of them, as I read, were cheap shots, guys tackling him while he was probably scrambling. So I think there's some limitations on him getting out and running, and if you get the heavy rush on him, like Oregon will probably push for, he'll just dump the ball off and get rid of it, or try to find somebody short and get rid of it, for a completion. But he won't hold on to it too long. He doesn't take too many shots. He doesn't get sacked very often. And that's because they go to great pains to protect him, because he was just like a punching bag at Indiana for 4 years.
And one question, just since we're talking about Penix, I feel like it's been really strange, especially coming out of the Apple Cup. Just, you wonder, is he healthy? Is he hurt? Is he sick? Because I think Ryan Grubb said he was under the weather in a media availability earlier this week, but you're out there in Seattle, so I'm just going to throw it out to you. What's the deal with Michael Penix, to your understanding?
Well, I've had all kinds of people contacting me trying to guess his situation. And, they said, oh, this NFL scout saw him throw the football, and this is what he thinks, that he's got a shoulder problem. And another guy said, oh, I think he's got a rib problem. And yet another guy just said, he's just lost his rhythm. And anyway, to his face yesterday, he looked pretty good. He's stuffed up, so he's got this cold or respiratory ailment that's hung with him for a month or so. I said, are you playing hurt? And he looked at me and just said, no. And, he's not going to tell me the truth if that's the case, but I asked him. So because I'd heard all this stuff, and I wrote a story that I'm going to use tomorrow that alludes to all of the conjecture over where is Michael Penix and what's going on in his head right now. Somebody said he might have had a panic attack at the end of the game, and that's why you wouldn't watch the final field goal if you saw the Fox broadcast. I don't know that to be the truth, but that's what somebody has guessed. And so there's all this stuff going on. He's actually a really tough kid, and he'll be ready to play. I don't know if he'll be as accurate as he was the first time he played Oregon, but I think he'll be ready to play. I don't think there'll be much difference in him.
Just to talk a little bit more about this offense, Dan, I really enjoyed watching Dylan Johnson run the ball. Super tough runner. Obviously had his marquee day and 256 yards against the Trojans. I think that was earlier this month, maybe last month. But he's a talented back. What can you tell me about Dylan Johnson and just the Huskies' ability to run the ball?
Well, I asked Dylan Johnson yesterday. I said, if Mike Leach was still with us, would you have made him proud? Because you're about 39 yards from becoming a 1,000-yard rusher. And the reason I asked that is because when he was at Mississippi State with the air raid, I don't think he ran for more than 448 yards in any one of his 4 seasons. He caught a lot of footballs, which he hasn't done at Washington, but he had, very limited rushing yards. So it's kind of flipped since he's got into Seattle. And he is, heads and tails over the other five running backs, and that he's a more physical, tougher runner, turning like 2-yard gains into 7-yard gains. And then occasionally, at USC, popped a couple of 40-yarders. So he's as healthy as he's been. He takes a lot of pounding. He's a different running back for Washington than he was for Mississippi State.
And to Oregon's credit, they've done a really good job defending the run this year. They've faced a lot of really good backfields, headlined by Utah and Oregon State last week with Damian Martinez and Deshaun Fenwick. Held Oregon State to a season low, I want to say, 53 rushing yards, and Marshawn Lloyd and the Trojans did a better job than I expected running the ball. But all that to say, Oregon is battle-tested against great rushing attacks, and I think it'd be foolish to say they're not battle-tested against great quarterbacks, because they've played Penix, they've played Caleb Williams, they've played Cam Ward, and Shedeur Sanders as well. Different scenario there because Colorado is not well-rounded like some of the other teams that I mentioned. So I think Oregon's going to do a good job defending the run. It's just really going to come down to how well can they get after Penix and how well can they defend these elite wide receivers in Las Vegas.
Yeah, well, you've got 2 football teams, One is unbeaten, and the other one is 3 points from being unbeaten. And I ask you to find a closer matchup than that anywhere in the last couple of years in any rivalry or any kind of championship game. It's almost like looking in the mirror. Washington looks in and sees Oregon, and Oregon the same thing. They both got great quarterbacks, great wide receivers, comparable defenses that seem to hold up and things like that. So that's why this game is so interesting and should be so well received by everyone in college football, is because these teams are real close. And so, I mean, I don't expect either one to blow either one out, but I just think it's going to be a close game that's probably going to be decided at the end by somebody.
Talking with Dan Raley, publisher of Inside the Huskies, on a Wednesday afternoon, previewing the Pac-12 title game between number 3 Washington and number 5 Oregon. We just got through talking a little bit about Washington's offense and Oregon's defense. Let's flip it now. Let's talk about the Oregon offense against the Washington defense, because the talk of the town, Dan, has been Washington's offense for so much of the year. We've just got through talking about some of Penix's struggles, how he maybe hasn't been as hot as he was at the beginning of the year. And Washington's defense, has been a big part of why they've been able to, be undefeated.
Well, the one thing with Washington's defense is it's been pretty generous, giving up a lot of points and a lot of yards, but it's absolutely owned the fourth quarter in all these games that they've played lately. They got pushed all over the field by Arizona State of all teams, and came back and shut them out in the second half and just absolutely held them down in the fourth quarter and won the game with an 89-yard interception return. The offense had nothing that day. So, the defense has done its part in keeping them unbeaten. It hasn't been anything to scare anybody that, hey, we're just going to get dominated. And the one example I use here is I covered a national championship football team at Washington in 1991. That shows you how old I am. And those guys were defensive dominant. And Washington is opposite right now with Penix. They're offensive dominant, but back in 91, the Husky defense was the dominant thing and didn't let anybody do anything. And their dominant player was Steve Entman, a huge pass rusher that went number 1 in the draft that year. But the stat that I use is that team in 12 games had 129 tackles for loss. This Husky team has 54. So This kind of shows you the difference in that national championship team. And they've tried to make up for it with offense, but they had real playmakers on defense 32 years ago and ran up tremendous amount of TFLs and sacks and turnovers, interceptions and all that. And this one just kind of does what's needed.
That's such an interesting comparison. That stat really was surprising to hear. And I know that the Huskies have, I think I would say a dude is kind of the terminology today, like a standout player, a really talented player at all 3 levels. You got Trice in the trenches as a great pass rusher. I don't want to butcher his name. Is it? It starts with a U, the linebacker. How do you say it?
Edifwan Ulufosio. And
there you go.
He's of Nigerian ancestry, and you know what his last name means?
What does it mean?
Unafraid of war.
How fitting is that?
Yeah.
So you have him at the linebacker spot, and then rounding it out, in my opinion, from my understanding, you have Jabbar Muhammad, the Oklahoma State transfer at cornerback, was just lights out all over the field in that Oregon State game. And those are kind of the main guys with this Washington defense, from my understanding. So I'd love to just kind of go through a little bit more, maybe just about those guys and what their importance is to this group.
Well, yeah. Trice has been double teamed, triple teamed. That's why his numbers are so far down, but he's been a force on every play. He's just a relentless rusher, and he disrupts everything, brings the quarterback out of the pocket. He has 6 sacks. Last year he had probably double that. He's going to be maybe a first-round draft pick. So he's somebody that everybody worries about. On the second row, Eddie Ulufosio he's been pretty solid. He missed 2 years pretty much with injuries, half of last year and half of the year before. But he covers a lot of ground in the football field, and he's kind of their, he's one of their captains and kind of keeps it all together. And then Muhammad is the big the big addition, because last year they got lit up by everybody. Everybody threw on him and threw deep on him, and he's kind of stopped some of that. He's got the great name Jabbar Muhammad, which he's named after two of the most famous athletes that have ever come through sport, meaning Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Muhammad Ali, if you didn't know that. But he left Texas, Oklahoma State, and his home state Texas, to come out to Washington because he wanted to play for somebody. I don't know if he got mixed up information, but he wanted to go to what he considered a cornerback school, and that's what it was under Jimmy Lake. I don't know if it's considered that now, under Kalen DeBoer, but he came out here looking for, a new place to play and see if he could get more of a platform for what he does. And I think that's worked. I think he'll be here just this 1 year. He has another year of eligibility, but he's been the big difference, because last year their secondary, they were down to the fourth string secondary guys last year after the two guys went off to the NFL, meaning Trent McDuffie and Kyler Gordon. And then the replacement starters got injured. The replacements for the replacement starters got injured. So then they were down to two guys that would typically have been fourth string guys had the NFL guys not left. So that's why they got lit up in those couple of games that they had, and we got tested in some others. So they fixed that a little bit.
Okay. So we're getting a good feel for some of the studs on Washington's defense and Oregon's offense. Dan, they're as hot as anybody right now. They're just putting up points in a hurry. They're explosive. I think for me, the real word that describes this offense is balance. They can take you, whether you're talking about running the ball down your throat or lighting you up through the air with guys like Troy Franklin. Tez Johnson is actually closing in on 1,000 receiving yards. So that would be a really special season for the Ducks to have both he and Troy Franklin eclipse the 1,000-yard mark, something that hasn't been done since Dylan Mitchell did it in 2018, obviously prior to Troy Franklin doing it this year. So I'm going to be looking for Oregon to establish the run, because the trenches are going to be incredibly important in this game, as you would expect. And I think that Bucky Irving has maybe not been struggling, but hasn't been maybe the star that we've been used to in the run game. But to his credit, he also can be a really effective receiver for Bo Nix out of the backfield. So I think that these groups definitely match up well. Oregon was able to put up, I think they've put up more than 30 points in every game this year. So we expect that to continue against Washington on Friday.
I'd agree with that. I think Washington, despite what you say about Bucky Irvin, I think they're really worried about him, because they would look at a matchup like this and say, well, we're going to get our passing yards and our touchdowns, so Oregon's going to get theirs too. So, that's a draw. We got to worry about if we give up too many rushing yards and scores to somebody like Irvin, who's a fast little back and gave him a lot of trouble last season. And so I think he's kind of crucial to, at least the offensive side of this.
He definitely is. And I think Oregon State did a good job of limiting the rushing attack for Oregon, but just seeing the physicality that offensive line has played with. And Dan, I think that's been one of the biggest stories of the year for Oregon, is just the play of that offensive line under Alik Terry, who came over from the Minnesota Vikings after serving as an assistant under Mario Cristobal and Alex Mirabal at Oregon previously. But I think that the play of the offensive line for Oregon has just been head and shoulders above, I think, what people could have expected, given the change in leadership with Adrian Clem going to the NFL and Vianney Talamaiva going to Stanford. That was a almost completely new offensive line staff. So I think for Oregon, the battle in the trenches is huge, and a big reason for their success has been Alik Terry.
And you've also recruited well. You brought in guys, and you seem to keep replacing big-time blockers with big-time blockers. I mean, Connerly is going to be an NFL player of some note when he's ready. And he's a big time player. And the center, I'm trying to think, he's got the hyphenated name with Johnson in it.
Howard Johnson.
He's your best guy, and he's getting all the accolades, and he'll be an NFL player. So yeah, Nix has got the luxury of that, just like Penix has got the luxury of, some veteran guys keeping people off his back. So, but no, Oregon, especially in the last, in their glory years here, they've done really well recruiting and bringing in guys in the trenches that are really good.
Yeah, and I think it's been exciting because for a while, I think it was dominated by offensive linemen. Obviously, Penei Sewell is the crown jewel of that, just kicking some butt with the Detroit Lions now, having an awesome NFL career after winning an Outland Trophy at Oregon. And And then you have Kayvon Thibodeau on the defensive side, first-round pick. So we're seeing more high-end defensive talent coming in, certainly under Dan Lanning, even in this 2024 recruiting class. But before we get to our score prediction, Dan, I want to circle back to a point you were saying earlier as we were kind of setting the stage for this game. You know this rivalry better than anybody I know. This is probably the most meaningful game that these two teams have ever played against each other. A Pac-12 title is on the line. A spot in the college football playoff is on the line. A potential Heisman Trophy. I mean, what a setting and what a way to go out of the Pac-12.
Yeah, it's nothing bigger. Nothing bigger at all. I mean, they used to think that Sonny Six Killer and Dan Fouts were huge Oregon-Washington games, but those guys didn't have, they had the quarterback profiles, but they didn't have the team profiles that these guys have. And those guys weren't in the running for the Heisman because they weren't going to vote, a guy from Oregon or Washington into the Heisman Trophy back then. They probably got some votes, but no, this thing has everything. And, it's almost hard to write about it because you could go off in 100 different tangents trying to figure out, who's got the edge here and who's got the edge there. And you've got the funny thing too is this is going to be their third game in 13 months and try and figure, see another college football scenario like that where they played almost 3 times, just over a year. So, they know each other about as well as anybody, and they're on the same tracks with these coaches coming in at the same time. So everything is identical. I mean, the program development, which they didn't waste time either side. The new coaches came in and just started winning. And now, they're trying to get in the college football playoff in the last one that would be through the Pac-12 avenue. And so it's this thing it should have everyone excited without question.
I'm super, super excited, and it should be a great game on Friday. And getting to go to some of these Oregon-Washington games myself, the first one I went to was in 2014 when the Ducks still had Marcus Mariota, and that was a 45-20 win over Washington. And then I was there last year when the Ducks lost in heartbreaking fashion to the Huskies in Eugene. So I'm excited to get my eyes on this matchup one last time as Pac-12 members. And man, yeah, just you couldn't draw up a better matchup. I think that's the best way you can put it, with everything on the line, with the seasons that all these players are having. It's just phenomenal, and I'm so grateful to be able to cover it.
Well, and these programs, outside of the Lanning and DeBoer eras, and even beyond that, they've kind of mirrored each other, even in a lot more ways. And the way I say that is, Don James came in and Washington pounded Oregon. I mean, beat them 15 out of 18 games and gloated over all of that. And so you knew that karma was going to come back to bite them. And Oregon turned this thing around and did something similar. And so they each beat each other up in similar ways in the last, 40 years or so. And so now it's almost like they're back to, being close again instead of being one with real dominant. And I think that's the way it should be, because this is, one of the 5 top cross-state rivalries in the country. And now they're going to Nevada to settle it, the championship of the Northwest and all of that other stuff we've talked about.
Yeah. The stage is definitely set, but let's get to our score predictions here as we wind down. I'm going to let you take center stage and give us your prediction first, and obviously the reasoning behind it.
Well, I don't take a lot of stock in my scores, my predictions, but I just threw it out there and thought, I'd look silly if I picked against Washington. I think all the Oregon fans would think that too. So I picked 27-23, even though I do believe Oregon has as good a chance to win this game as Washington does. I don't see any real distinctive advantage outside of Oregon's defense might be a little bit better than Washington's defense. But, your wide receivers, your quarterback, your coaches are the same year at the schools. The results are almost similar with outside of point differentials, but the records are almost identical. They're almost identical in the CFP rankings, the AP rankings, all the way down the board. I should have probably picked a 1-point game, but I just somehow out of the top of my head, for no particular reason, I picked 27-23.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because that's kind of how I start my prediction stories. Is I'll throw a score on the page, and then I'll write kind of my thoughts, and then I'll get to the bottom and be like, how do I still feel about that? Is kind of how I like to go about it. But I definitely feel really confident in Oregon in this matchup, kind of along the lines of what you were saying. Just kind of would feel funny to not pick them, but I think a lot of what you've seen transpire throughout the year, especially what you've seen from the Ducks since they lost to the Huskies on Montlake earlier this year, I think Oregon has a whole lot of momentum, as does Washington. They got a stellar quarterback leading the way. I think they do have the edge when it comes to the defense, even though they are possibly going to be shorthanded with Jaleel Florence's status up in the air. But I think that Washington hasn't looked like the same team since they played Oregon. And I think that's one of the big reasons why I find myself going with the Ducks. I'm a little bit more confident that they might be able to create some separation in this game. I got Oregon 42, Washington 31, covering the spread.
Fair enough. I think one thing you should remember, though, and everybody is so caught up in comparative scores, how, Washington barely beat Arizona State and the Ducks just stuffed Arizona State. Well, what everyone forgets is that all that matters is the matchup. And the matchup is so different with Washington playing Oregon than those two schools playing Arizona State or Washington State or USC. It means nothing really that Washington, beat USC by 10 points. It's how they do against Oregon, how that matchup is against Oregon, who wins the trenches, who's the better quarterback. And that's what makes this matchup so good, is nobody really knows. And, the odds makers think they know. The Duck fans think they know. The Husky fans are convinced that they know, but nobody really knows. And it all depends on who's ready to play on Friday and who's not. And I think it'll be so close that one little tiny screw up is going to decide this whole thing. Might be an 11-point difference, right?
Yeah, well, we'll see. No, I think, everything you said is definitely super valid. And I think that we've seen sentiments like that from Lanning himself when we were talking about the Utah matchup in particular earlier this year, talking about how they never lose basically in Salt Lake. But he said that doesn't matter because those are all games in the past. And Oregon obviously went into Salt Lake and did what they did. But yeah, I think I still feel overall confident that Oregon's going to be able to get the job done. We know it's hard to beat the same team twice in the same year. I think that holds true for a lot of games, but just wanted to get some of your final thoughts here, Dan, before we wrap up.
Well, one thing that people have lost sight on too, because he's so kind of unassuming, is I think people don't realize how good a football coach that Kalen DeBoer is. He walked into a 4-8 program last year and turned it into 11-2. And all he did was bring in a quarterback. He just used what was left, where he went down to USC and go down to Colorado. They ran everybody off and rebuilt the whole thing and did a massive teardown. He just came in and brought in his own quarterback, a few other people that, weren't as necessary as the quarterback was. So I think, if you're an Oregon fan, you got to go, I like our chances because our quarterback's great. Our team is great, but is there something about this DeBoer guy? Should we be worried? Is he going to figure out a way to beat us with a lesser team or with a team just as good? Because he's 25, or he's 23-2. He's 100 and whatever, 111 and 7. I can't quote that record for sure, but he's got some kind of magical Midas touch. I think when he gets to the Big Ten, it might even out a little bit more, because I think he's gonna have to rebuild next year in a brand new league. But this game has got to have Oregon fans really confident, but yet concerned about the coach more than the players. Does this guy have a magic touch? Is this guy going to outthink us and outcoach us? Because I think he did last year in Eugene. The Ducks had that game in hand and they got out of hand. And when that happens, you usually point to the coaches for that. So
I'm super glad you brought up DeBoer, because I wanted to ask you about him. I just couldn't find the right time or the right way to do it. But yeah, Oregon fans aren't going to want to hear it, but as someone who covers the Ducks, you got to give a tip of the cap to DeBoer and the job that he's done over there in Seattle to get Washington into this situation. He almost beat Oregon when he was at Fresno State a couple years ago. I know the Duck fans got a scare from that one, but no, Dan, really awesome conversation. I'm so glad that I got to bring you on and share your awesome insight with my audience. But before we get out of here, I wanted to give you a chance to plug where people can find more of your work in the college football space.
Well, we're at si.com/college/Washington. And then, I'm on all social media accounts, and we've been around for a good 4 years, and we've seemed to got it. We have it rolling. People know who we are and what we're doing, and it seems to be working. So yeah, I mean, I'd be retired now if this hadn't turned the corner like it did. I mean, it was really sad to see what happened to Washington 2 years ago, because they had great players, and he completely ran the thing into the ground. And when I say he, I mean the previous coach. So I've hung around because it's interesting to watch the rebuild, which wasn't a rebuild. It was just kind of a fix. And now we're looking at a fantastic football game. So, I mean, it was well worth it. And personally, outside of the success of my website, I don't care who wins on Friday. When Washington wins, my website gets a lot more traffic and profitable and all of that. But I'm just going to a football game to be totally entertained and try and write a good story on Friday. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'm definitely glad that you stuck around, because it meant that we got to have our paths cross. So make sure you guys lock in with Dan and check out his awesome stuff if you want to get a better pulse on the Huskies heading into Friday's matchup. If you want to find more of me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at mtorresports. Subscribe to my YouTube channel at Oregon Football Max Torres, and you can read all of my work covering the Ducks in print, in text, over on ducksdigest.com. But until next time, appreciate you guys so much. Thank you to Dan for coming on, and we will see you in the next episode of the Ducks Dish Podcast.